If there's one thing that bothers Stephen Lee about the legal profession, it's about the ineptitude with respect to interviewing.
I think, what's funny about law school, you're taught how to do legal research and make legal arguments and things like that. But in real life, in the actual practice of law, most of it is about figuring out what happened factually. And for that, I actually think lots of lawyers do not get good training, if any training, on how to do that. But I came into the law with a lot of background in that, with journalism. It struck me, actually, mystery novels, detective fiction, because the problem is, where do you see? People don't usually see the interviews. And the interviews are kind of like the things people do in order to write their briefs or their books or their articles, but you don't actually get to see the stuff that goes into it. And that's what struck me as actually very interesting, because everyone who reads a mystery novel is probably reading like the detective interviewing, a witness or a suspect. It struck me that there's some really good interviews out there in detective fiction, and there's some really bad ones.
Fingers crossed that you're in store for one of the really good ones. Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And listeners like you who support us on Patreon or Substack, sign up for exclusive benefits at patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 299, Interrogating Sherlock Holmes.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
I'm Bill Curtis. This is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now here are your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder.
Oh, thank you very much, Bill Curtis. Well, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, are you ready to be interrogated?
I take the 5th, Your Honor.
Where were you on the night of the 18th?
Yeah, good question. Where was I on the night of the 18th? Where do you think I was, Your Honor?
And that is the question. To be there or not to be there?
That's the question.
Well, this is going to be a fascinating discussion. As you heard there from the clip just before the show started, Stephen Chahn has a lot of thoughts about Sherlock Holmes and a lot of logical, fact-based thoughts about Sherlock Holmes. These aren't flights of fancy we're talking about, which is encouraging. But, as we are sitting here recording this, Bert, I'm looking at my Sherlock Holmes page-a-day calendar.
Oh.
Which, by the way, the 2025 version of the Sherlock Holmes page-a-day calendar is available for order from our sponsor, MX Publishing. So you might want to check that out on their website. That's not an ad. That's just that's free from us because we like these calendars so much. The one I'm looking at today has a quote from the Three Gables. I am not the law, but I represent justice, so far as my feeble powers go.
Oh, that's excellent. How apt.
Yeah. Well, we're going to hear a discussion with Stephen Lee that shows that his powers are not feeble by any stretch of the imagination. And he will bring you into a world that perhaps few have considered before this time. So stay tuned for that. Just a reminder, if you'd like to support the show, you can do that on Substack or on Patreon. We're available in both places. You can go to patreon.com/ihearofsherlock or ihearofsherlock.substack.com. Support us to whatever level makes sense for you. We do have ad-free versions of the shows in each of those locations, as well as bonus material for you from time to time. Stay tuned later in the show. We do have the Canonical Couplet available, everyone's favorite part of the show. Unfortunately, because of production limitations, we will not be having Sherlockian news or a chance of listening from Madeline Quinones this time around. We will resume those in the very next episode. So if you'd like to write in with hate mail or other complaints, please feel free to contact us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com.
Yeah, well, or you could use the other email address, which is no reply at ihearofsherlock.com.
Or write to Bert Wolder at
yes, at forgetaboutit.com. Wolder at forgetaboutit.com. So.
That's awesome. Well, of course, you can also phone a friend in the guise of us as your friends. We are available at, what's our phone number again? Oh, yes, it is 5-1895 221B5. Did you get that?
Yes.
That is
sure.
518-952-2125. If you'd like to drop us a voicemail there or simply make a recording in your phone and attach it to an email, we'd love to hear from you. Just in time for the holiday season, our friends at MX Publishing have Mr. Holmes's Advent Calendar, a 4-book series. Even in the Advent season, Mr. Holmes can't take a break. Murderers, blackmailers, and all kinds of odd incidents keep him on the go. And Watson isn't much of a help, as he's busying himself with baking all those Christmas cookies for his dog. Mr. Holmes's criminal fiction Advent Calendar has 24 short detective stories that challenge your puzzle-solving skills, one for each day of Advent. Follow in the famous master detective's footsteps and use the evidence available to deduce what might have happened, find vital clues, decipher codes, check alibis, and solve the crime case until the next morning when you turn the page and find Mr. Holmes's solution and another exciting case waiting for you. It's great fun for all fans of Sherlock Holmes and criminal fiction. Solve the mystery and be faster than the famous detective. Check out all 4 volumes of Mr. Holmes's Advent Calendar by MX Publishing today. Stephen Lee was a federal prosecutor in Chicago for 11 years before going into private practice. As assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Illinois, he won convictions in all 17 trials that he did, including 6 trials in which he cross-examined the defendant. He appeared once before the United States Supreme Court and served as senior counsel to his office's healthcare fraud unit. From 1995 to 1997, he was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, and between 2001 and 2006, he created and edited Footnote TV, where he reverse-engineered TV shows that ripped from the headlines, such as The West Wing and Law & Order, explaining the real-life issues that were depicted in those shows. He's given talks for the Federal Bar Association, including one about Sherlock Holmes, offering great lessons for real-life investigations. He writes the Modern Detection newsletter on Substack and wrote Sherlock Holmes and the Silent Contest. In 2024, Stephen was invested in the Baker Street Irregulars as Alec MacDonald. Stephen Lee, welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Well, let's begin at the beginning, shall we? Where did you first meet Sherlock Holmes?
Let's see. I think I'm a bit different from a lot of Sherlockians in that I really came to Sherlock Holmes kind of on the later stage as an adult. So for me, what happened was I think I had watched the BBC series and was a big fan and realized that I hadn't actually read a lot of the original stories. And so I wanted to go do that. And when I did that, I was already working as a federal prosecutor. And so I think I had a bit different perspective than maybe a lot of people did in reading the stories. And so as I read the stories, there were just a lot that resonated with me about the stories because I had that perspective. I think two things really stood out. One was that they actually held up really well from an investigative point of view. I think a lot of people, if you work in a field, it's always painful to see pop culture depictions. Like if you're a doctor, medical shows are probably painful to watch because of all the things they do. But I actually found that they actually held up really well. And some of the stuff that Holmes did and some of the techniques he did were actually really well done and just actually good examples for what real life investigators should be doing when doing cases. So that really stood out to me and really impressed me. And the second thing was seeing how there was just some things in the stories that didn't make a lot of sense to me in terms of kind of why would Watson be writing about those things? And that's what really got me thinking much more about it and got me kind of more into my own writing and analysis of the canon.
Yeah. And I have to say, you are not the first lawyer we've had on the show. We've had a number of those on before. In fact, we actually covered one show about canon law, which was one of the BSI books publications. It was in the Profession series from BSI Press. So we talked a lot, wide-ranging aspects of law in the Sherlock Holmes stories. But I must say, you are the first federal prosecutor that we've had on the show. So,
Former.
Former, right. Well, once a federal prosecutor, always a federal prosecutor. So I have to say, I'm a little intimidated here. and Bert, we have to be careful lest the questions get turned around on us.
Well, Scott, you have the right to counsel before you submit to questioning. But anything you use will certainly be used against you by me. So
please do. Yeah. So, Stephen, we were talking a little bit before the show began about some of the skills, the talents that prosecutors need to have, and the parallels to mystery writing. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that kind of struck me over the years, both when I was a prosecutor and now that I'm in private practice, is that so much of the work of investigations and litigating cases is not really taught in law school. A lot of the real work, in law school, you learn about making legal arguments and things like that. But very few cases in real life really hinge on these subtle legal arguments. What really drives most of litigation is figuring out what happened. Figuring out what happened and being able to communicate that to a judge or to a jury. And that is much more aligned with investigative skills and writing and argument. And that's something that's really just not taught a lot in law school, not that way. And so, I thought about this a lot because, where do people go wrong? How can people do better? And one of the things I realized was that actually very few people, in the course of law school read how an investigation got done and, how a good interview is done. But I realized that people actually read this stuff all the time in mystery novels. Because if you read a mystery novel, you are going to read a detective interviewing a witness or a suspect at some point, almost always. And some of those interviews are really good and some of them are really bad. But it's kind of interesting to look at those and see if there's lessons to be gleaned. And one of the things that I think about actually is the Sherlock Holmes stories actually have some great examples of how to do a competent, good investigation. So, for example, I think in Studying Scarlet has a great example of a nice interview where Sherlock Holmes interviews John Rance, the police officer who is the first one to report the murder, the first murder in A Study in Scarlet. And that exchange is I've actually used that as a teaching point to talk about how Holmes is actually listening to the person he's interviewing. He's asking good follow-up questions. And at a really crucial point, he asks to clarify the terminology that's being used. Because one of the things I've seen happen in real life is when someone says something and the person who hears it hears something different. So actually, when I was a prosecutor, I had a case where that I took over, and some of the strongest evidence supposedly against the person was a statement that she made right after being arrested. And when I saw it, when I took over the case, I looked at it and it's like, it just didn't sound right to me. So I dug in and I figured out it was actually kind of like a My Cousin Vinny moment where she said the words that were written down in the report, but it was totally taken out of context and it really wasn't as strong or as powerful as the report made it sound. So I ended up actually dropping those charges after I figured all that out. But I think the nice thing about the Sherlock Holmes interview of John Rance is he picks up on that. He picks up on this use of terminology. It's a great little exchange that I think is just so important because Holmes asks at one point, he's asking for Rance to describe the scene, what he saw, how he came upon the murder site. And he asks at one point, was the street empty then? And Rance replies, well, it was, as far as anybody that could be of any good goes. And that's a really interesting answer, right? Because it's not a yes or no answer. And, Holmes actually asks the right follow-up question. He picks up on that and he asks for clarification. What do you mean? And that's when he figures out there was someone there. I think that's kind of like, it's a little point, but it's so crucial. And I think a lot of people actually miss that because they're not picking up on these things. They're not listening and they don't know how to conduct a really good investigative interview. Because it really is a lot of times these cases, in real life really do hinge on these little details that only come out if you're really listening and really paying attention.
That's a fabulous example, and the interesting thing too is it does run through the cases of Sherlock Holmes, but it also runs through the life of Conan Doyle, who became involved in the George Edelgy case, where he was accused of mutilating animals, and it turned out, upon Conan Doyle's own personal investigation, that he didn't have the eyesight that would have made it possible for him to do the acts that he was accused of. And apparently everybody missed that in what passed for the investigation at the time.
Right. Yeah, I think so much of the work that I do and involves just making sure, like checking assumptions, seeing things, if they, is it really that way? Or because I think in real life is right. It's complicated. There are a lot of coincidences. There's lots of things that go wrong. And a lot of times these cases really do hinge on doing these, really digging in and asking for these details and picking up on these things. And that was what's actually great about the Holmes stories, right? Because actually the thing that I love, and I think is just so important about his approach, is that he's not a superhero. He's not some magician. He's just very well trained. Right? He talks about this in A Study in Scarlet, the whole idea of like, if you studied 1,000 cases, you know what to look for. You know the things that matter. You should be able to figure out the 1,001st more easily. And I saw that in my experience as a prosecutor. The first time I did a bank robbery case or a healthcare fraud case, there I had to. It was a lot of figuring things out. It was a lot of it was very confusing and hard the first time, but the more you do them and the more you test the cases out over time, like it becomes more obvious what to look for. And, you start to see things that other people wouldn't see. And so that's definitely resonates with my own experience.
So you've got a few publications here we want to talk about, and I'm going to work backwards because there's a pair, I should say, of publications, volumes 1 and 2 of Modern Detection, which actually stem from a newsletter that you started when you left federal practice and opened your own practice. You started a newsletter. Talk a little bit about Modern Detection and what inspired that, and if people are able to pick up these volumes, what they might expect.
Yeah, well, I think the big thing was realizing that so much of our life depends on investigations and understanding how, if they're done well or if they're done poorly. And I think so part of it is trying to figure out, is there some kind of way to help people understand that? Because we're also dependent on this in terms of, like, when we read a newspaper article, we're kind of trusting that that is done well. When we hear about someone being charged with a crime, we are trusting that the people did a good job. But I think just the sad reality is sometimes, often is, but sometimes it isn't. And so part of it was trying to figure out how to basically approach that and help people understand what goes into that. And one of the things I like to talk about there is kind of like looking at real life and fictional examples of investigations and trying to draw upon that to kind of help explain, how to do these better and how to evaluate them better. And so for that, some of the articles talk about Sherlock Holmes. Some of them talk about, Agatha Christie. I have to admit, I do find that I love the interviewing technique in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm not as impressed with Poirot's interviewing techniques. I
think a key chapter titled "How Hercule Poirot Botched a Key Interview" gave that away.
Yeah. And I just think it's kind of interesting because it's definitely, there are things that I think lawyers can see, and especially people who've done this kind of stuff see, but a lot of times the general public doesn't. So I think the newsletter really was kind of an idea of trying to, try to share these stories in a way to help. It's kind of, I think it was somewhat inspired by kind of one idea that Holmes supposedly had, which is that at some point he himself was going to write The Art of Detection, right? Kind of talking about collecting all of his wisdom and techniques and advice. And obviously, we don't have that, but it struck me that it's an interesting idea, and if I can kind of contribute somehow to that missing literature, that was my goal.
Well, it's fascinating. Have you ever thought about teaching? Have you done any? I mean, I know you have a practice, and so within the practice, I'm sure you have the opportunity to help your staff, develop their skills. But have you ever thought about teaching?
I've written and I've spoken. I haven't really taught in a school setting, but no, I've spoken at bar associations. I've spoken to forensic analysts, and so I have spoken, and I've actually given talks using the Sherlock Holmes stories in that regard. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, and I'm hoping to contribute because, yeah, to be honest, I think we could all do better. I think there's a lot, I have some clients who I've been able to help. In the past year, I had 2 clients who I was able to help get them completely cleared of criminal charges that were brought against them. I was so happy that I could do that. I wish they hadn't had to go through that whole experience. And in both cases, there were some pretty big mistakes that the government made early on in their investigation that really just kind of led to years of misery for my clients before they were finally cleared. I wish they hadn't had to go through that. So I think it's better for everyone if investigations are done better. And, so happy to help talk about that.
Well, I'm like Sherlock Holmes, who envisioned himself eventually doing a series of lectures or essays on his practice. Very, very kind of similar scenario. Let's talk about Sherlock Holmes and the Silent Contest. This is the publication that predates both volumes of Modern Detection. It was published in January 2022. I found the premise for this absolutely fascinating for a couple of reasons, Stephen. One, I had never thought of it this way before. I hadn't thought about what Sherlock Holmes was doing, how Watson supported it with respect to Moriarty. But more importantly, I appreciated the investigator's mind that you brought to this and the way you kind of unwound things and built the case up to us over the course of this booklet. I'm interested to hear how you present to the public, what this book is about, and take us through the thinking a little bit that got you started.
Yeah, it was not something I expected to do, but when I read the stories, I was particularly interested in Moriarty. I think even for people who've never read a Sherlock Holmes story, you know of Sherlock Holmes and Professor Moriarty. And so when I started reading the stories, that was the thing that I found most interesting and was most looking forward to. Because also that kind of resonates most with the kind of work that I did when I was a prosecutor in terms of building cases. Now, when most mystery novels, most mystery stories are about who did it, trying to figure out who did the murder. But in my practice, when I was a prosecutor, that really wasn't the main thing. We often had a pretty good sense who did it from the very beginning. The hard part was building the case. Really how do you actually get the evidence that's good enough to really bring charges, beyond a reasonable doubt against someone? That was the hard part. And so that's the kind of thing that I was expecting to read when I got to the Moriarty stories. And I think the thing that really struck me upon reading The Final Problem was we don't get that at all. We really skip, Holmes skips a lot of that. So there's this whole thing where when you read The Final Problem, it talks about how Watson hasn't seen Holmes in a while. Holmes shows up. He basically says, I've been doing this investigation of this criminal mastermind. It's the most brilliant piece of deduction that's ever happened. And if I could tell you, it would be amazing. But we don't got time. We got to go. We're on the run. And the rest of the story is basically a chase, throughout Europe, ending up at the Reichenbach Falls. And so Holmes largely skips over the story that I really wanted to read, which is how did he bring down Professor Moriarty? And so I was like, okay, all right, I guess we don't get it. And I remember thinking, okay, and I thought maybe there's something there. But the thing that really struck me was reading The Valley of Fear, because The Valley of Fear actually does explain a lot more about how Holmes investigated Moriarty, but it completely contradicts part of The Final Problem. And there's this really key exchange that really stuck out to me in The Final Problem, where Holmes asks Watson, you have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty. And Watson says, never. And then you have a very similar exchange in The Valley of Fear. Holmes, you've heard me speak of Professor Moriarty. Watson, the famous scientific criminal, as famous among crooks as he is unknown to the public. So when I read that, there's no way, that really struck me, because those two passages completely contradict each other, and I didn't think this could be reconciled as a slip of the tongue or bad memory. And this is something lots of other people have noticed over the years. Vincent Starrett, William Baring Gould, Nicholas Meyer. I mean, everyone's kind of recognized, some of these questions about the Moriarty account. But the thing that I think struck me was I thought, well, maybe this is kind of like some of the investigations that we do in real life in law enforcement, where you're investigating someone for a long time. You don't want them to know that you're onto them or investigating them. And so you do things like play dumb at times because you want to lull your target into complacency. So once I thought about that idea and could that explain this discrepancy between the final problem and the Valley of Fear? That's what really set me on my path, because then I went back and I reread the entire canon to see if this could work. And so a lot of it really was kind of reconstructing things. And, I have, lots of notes I made, I tried fitting things into chronology, into a timeline, and really trying to see, could this idea hold up? And basically I thought it did. And that's what led me to writing The Silent Contest.
Wow.
It's really an interesting take on things, and it's done in such a way that it's convincing. I mean, you don't spare the facts. You lay it out there before us, and I love the process you undertook, where you identified the two stories that are told by an omniscient third person. And your observation was, well, since this is being told by a third person, by an omniscient narrator, then we have to accept everything that happened in those stories as fact. We just recorded and released an episode of Trifles where we talked about Watson as an unreliable narrator. And I think that's very much the case. When we are getting the quote-unquote facts from Watson, we're getting them presented in whatever format or whatever style he wanted to present them to us in, as a storyteller, as someone who had some sort of goal at the end of his writing. And when we compare that to those two stories, and remind me which two those were, Mazarin Stone, maybe? And I forget the other one.
Let's see. There's Mazarin, and then I think, the lion's mane is him narrating in the first person.
Right.
That's
so
Holmes.
His Last Bow is the other one. Right.
But yeah, I think the idea of the unreliable narrator is really important, and it's something that's the lens through which we do see everything, most of Holmes. And so that was the big thing. It's like, why would Watson write about some of these things? Now, because I thought about this myself, because as a lawyer, I cannot reveal my client's secrets, right? Unless they consent. And so that's one thing. Why would Watson be writing some of these stories? How could he write some of these stories? And that's one thing that if you think about it, if you assume that we're in a world where Watson actually is publishing these stories to a general audience, why would he be doing this? And that was one of the things that I talk about and think through in The Silent Contest, which is a lot of the reasons why he might have written don't really make a lot of sense. But the stories could make more sense if you view them as a way to lull Moriarty into complacency. I mean, one of the big things I think about is the whole idea about how, one is, we see in The Sign of Four, right? That's where the second story, that's where we see the introduction of the drug use, right? And that, first of all, it contradicts what's said in A Study in Scarlet, but also, why would Watson be telling the people of London about how this great detective is shooting up heroin and doing cocaine on a regular basis, right? It doesn't really make a lot of sense that he would tell the world about this, except it's really tied to him being bored, right? It's tied to the idea he's so bored because there are no great crimes out there, and there's nothing challenging him. When in fact, from the Valley of Fear, if you accept the Valley of Fear, he actually is aware of Moriarty this entire time. And so thus, it does seem like, well, maybe that's why maybe that gives Watson a reason to say that Holmes is using drugs, whether or not he actually is, because it basically helps make Moriarty not take Holmes seriously as a threat. And I think that's kind of the big thing. Like, lots of people have seen the inconsistencies in the stories, especially the early stories. But I think I think the thing that I hopefully contributed was a possible motive for doing this that actually fits with Holmes and Watson being the heroes that, we all hopefully, love and accept.
Yeah, it really does. It certainly fits what we know. It is a plausible explanation. And I think the other thing is that, to me, it raises Watson's profile in my mind. Because to think we have this wonderful friend, colleague, and narrator who is able to convey these wonderful tales to us, but to know that at the same time he was threading a needle where he had to make Sherlock Holmes seem brilliant to most of us, at the same time that he had to make him seem vulnerable with the audience of Moriarty.
Mm-hmm.
So it's when you couch it that way, it actually raises our estimation of Watson as a writer.
I completely agree. I think it makes the whole writing process fascinating and really trying to think through what he was trying to accomplish, how to accomplish it. And I think anyone who writes, you got to make choices. And it really, in this dance Watson's doing. And I love to imagine the idea of Watson drafting these things, working with Holmes to figure out what to say, what not to say. And I do think the choices that he's making in terms of what to cover up, what to conceal. And that's where, I think rereading the stories with this idea in mind is really fun, because it does give you new ideas like, well, what's Watson really doing when he says this, right? What's he really trying to accomplish here? And what's really going on? And, I do think there's certain things in the stories we all, that I think you accept, and working like, okay, so with these fixed points, like, okay, well, what's really going on? I just think it's a lot of fun to consider a new way of looking at the stories.
Well, it's fascinating, and in your writing, you've gone back to even the beginning in A Study in Scarlet, when you've pointed out, even in that first story, we have an old woman who appears to outwit Holmes, and then we never see or hear from her again.
Yeah, and I just find that such a fascinating person, right? And it's like, well, why is Watson including that, right? Why is Watson including that part of the story? And who is this person, and why do we never hear of this person ever again? Someone who is such a good actor or actress that they can basically fool Sherlock Holmes in the course of a meeting, and has the acrobatic ability to basically get out of a moving carriage without getting themselves harmed, without Holmes seeing when he's following them. So that's really interesting. And, one of the things I talk about is this whole idea of like, well, we don't know. Like, one of the big mysteries in the canon is Porlock. Right, we hear of Porlock in the Valley of Fear, and this person who is within Moriarty's organization and is giving information to Holmes, kind of his inside source. But we never get a canonical answer as to who Porlock is. So that's one of the things I I explore and I like to think about, like, who could this person be? Maybe it is some of those people who get portrayed in a way in the stories that we either overlook or we don't think much of. Maybe it was that person from A Study in Scarlet. Maybe it was Irene Adler, because if you think about the story in A Scandal in Bohemia, there's a lot of things in that story that don't really make a lot of sense as to why Watson would actually be writing that story. So is there some secret motive going on? Perhaps he's trying to, allay Moriarty's suspicions from the acrobat or from Irene Adler or someone like that by writing about them in these other ways.
Well, and and the lovely thing about this is, you start right at the beginning here, and you find this first inconsistency. This may be maybe the very first big inconsistency in Watson's account of Sherlock Holmes, and it's the very first story. But you use this as sort of the first thread in the web of Moriarty, and say, at some point, maybe this was the first clue that Holmes ever received about Moriarty's existence, and that it's somehow connected to this mysterious female figure.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think especially there's lots of things in that story that, in hindsight or with this lens, I think become really fun to think about. So yeah, no, I think it's a hopefully a fun way of looking at the stories.
So if you had your way, and you were able to discover what happened between January and April of 1891, all those run-ins between Holmes and Moriarty's organization, how would you tell the story?
Yeah, no, I've thought about that a lot, and I think it'd be really fun. It's a really fun thing to do. And, well, first of all, we know it actually goes back even further, right? We know that he was actually, what we read in The Final Problem, the story he skips over, I think it actually isn't true. I think the investigation started much earlier. And so first of all, there's that. But yeah, no, I think about that a lot in terms of because I think that is a lot very similar to kind of the long-term kind of investigations that I think that I used to do as a prosecutor, and that are regularly being done nowadays. So a few things. So first of all, we know from The Valley of Fear that Holmes broke into Moriarty's office at one point. We know that Holmes tried to investigate Moriarty's finances. That's a pretty typical thing in kind of the complex modern investigations. I think a big thing that I think really probably had to have happened is he needed kind of to flip people, get people to turn on Moriarty and kind of tell him things. I think that's kind of that's a key part of real life investigations. It's hard to know what's going on inside a criminal organization without some help from people within the organization. So I think that's probably a key part of how Holmes would have really brought down Moriarty, getting someone on the inside to help him out and, get him the information, get him the records, things like that. So a lot of times in real life, a lot of that happens when you kind of get, when the government kind of gets a lower level person, manages to bring charges or build a case against a lower level person. And then the person kind of, in trying to get themselves out of trouble for that case, gives up information on someone higher up. I guess one of the most famous examples in recent years of that is the whole Operation Varsity Blues, the college admissions, scandal and cases. That all started really because the government caught some guy, on a securities fraud case. And he basically was looking to cut a deal and help him out of all the trouble he was in for the securities fraud case, the securities fraud charges that he had committed. And he said, hey, I know of this guy. And he was the first one to tell the government about how he was getting shaken down for a bribe in terms of college admissions. And then that led And that was the thing that eventually led them to bringing down the entire, Varsity Blues operation.
Well, it's a wonderful parallel and a wonderful example.
I think it's a tale for which the world is prepared.
Someday.
Yeah. But I think, this is also the other interesting thing is that you were invested into the Baker Street Irregulars in 2024 with the name of Alec MacDonald. And we know that Alec MacDonald, consulted on the murder of John Douglas at Burleston and was initially very skeptical that the case was connected with Professor Moriarty. And it just shows you the nice alignment between your investiture into the Irregulars and this entire theme of investigation, interviewing, discovering hidden facts, connections to Moriarty. It's a really nice resonance there.
Yeah, I'm very thrilled and honored to have that name. It's a lot of fun.
These Baker Street Irregulars seem to know what they're doing.
Well, with some exceptions, yes.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. Where can people go to find out more about you, your practice, your interest in Sherlock Holmes, etc.?
And to get the books. Where can they get the books?
Yeah, well, I've the book, The Silent Contest, all my Sherlock Holmes works, I've just self-published and I've been distributing them myself. So that's worked for now. Maybe that'll change in the future. But the best way is just to contact me, and you can find me, online. And I also have been, in the practice of actually at the BSI weekend, actually giving out copies. So that's how the best way to kind of, but the best way is to just contact me, and I can either give people hard copies or, send them a PDF. And also, you can also find a lot of my stuff online. There's a Substack for modern detection, and there's also a lot of my stuff's also on my practices webpage, which is stephenleelaw.com.
Excellent. Well, we will have links to all of those in the show notes. Stephen Lee, thank you so much for being on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thanks. Great to be here.
What a lot of fun that conversation was.
Most fun I've ever had speaking to a prosecutor.
I didn't do it, Your Honor. I didn't do it, I tell you. Yeah, but there's this element of romance and Gothic in Sherlock Holmes and imagining 1895 and fog-bound streets and gaslight and all of this. But there's also an element of relevance. And Stephen really puts his finger on the heartbeat of relevance in Sherlock Holmes. The elements about getting the facts and interviewing technique and the importance of clarity and how that relates to the whole path to justice. And then the other thing is his work just shows you what is yet to be done with Sherlockian writing and Sherlockian scholarship. I mean, here it is, the third decade of the 21st century. And he's just connected this very much to real world issues and legal practice today, and it's interesting. I just think that's really something. Yeah.
It is, and I think the beauty of this is we spend so much time admiring the stories for being great works of fiction, great storytelling. We admire Conan Doyle and his process, and we make excuses for him and the timelines and everything like that. We manage to piece everything together, but as you say, when we peel it all back and look at the bare bones of it, it is very realistic. It is very true to life. It is tied directly to human behavior as we knew it then and as we know it now. And I think that's what makes this still possible, to go through these exercises and make these observations and draw these lessons out in the 21st century. Oh, you know what that is. Yes, it means it's time for everyone's favorite part of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. That's right, it's Canonical Couplet, where we give you 2 lines of poetry, and you have to tell us which Sherlock Holmes story we are talking about. If you remember around these parts, the last time we gave you this clue. A curse-encumbered household in the West, inspired of all the detective tales, is best. Bert, do you know which Sherlock Holmes story we're talking about?
Sure, yes, indeed. That's the one where Holmes uses a mirror to crack the case of a disguised old eccentric who is living in a rooming house. It's the case Watson called The Veiled Codger.
Boy, I knew I could count on you.
1, 2, 3,
and thank
4.
goodness I paid the union dues of the trombonist here in the studio. So we're in good shape. Well, no, once again, you've done it, Magoo.
What?
I know, right?
Wrong again?
Well, we turn to our good friend Eric Deckers, who has come through again saying, by Jove, I believe I have solved it. It's the story of a lovable dog who only wants to serve the family he's sworn to protect and the young fox who befriends him. This unlikely duo gets into mischief, which causes great grief to the dog's family. It's the story Watson called The Fox and the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Fox and the Hound.
Except, writes Eric, Wikipedia seems to have no record of that story, so it's probably more likely just The Hound of the Baskervilles. Which is too bad, because the other story sounded like an instant classic.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Well, that was a good one, Eric. But we will say no, that in fact was not exactly. Well, it was Hound of the Baskervilles, but Fox and the Hound of the Baskervilles, I agree. That would be fun. Somebody should write that, you know?
Yeah.
Well, let's turn to the big prize wheel and put all the entries in and see exactly what we come up with. Okay, going around and landing on number 22, lucky double 2, and that looks like it is Andrew Van Loon. Andrew, congratulations. I think, what was the prize from last time? Nothing. You get nothing. No, we get you get an item from the vault.
So we're sharing our paychecks with you. That's,
yes. Or actually, it was we had Ed Pettit on last time. So, well, maybe we can get you a ticket to Sherlock Monthly, if that is indeed a ticketed item. We'll talk that over with Ed.
It's
and see
free.
what we
Unfortunately, Sherlock Monthly is free.
It's free.
Well,
then,
fortunately, Sherlock Monthly
please
is free. Then we'll definitely get you a ticket.
Have a ticket on us, yeah, and then we'll get you something from the vaults as well. That should be fun. Okay, well, let's turn to the Oracle here and see exactly what we have for this episode's Canonical Couplet clue. When a man of questionable ethics lays his past bare, only photographic proof can spoil the affair. If you know the answer to this episode's Canonical Couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with Canonical Couplet in the subject line. If you are among all of the correct answers and we choose your name at random, you'll win. Good luck. You. Should be a good one. Should be a good one. Well, what do you think, Bert?
You know, that's the question. What do I think? That puzzles me most of the day.
To no end.
Yeah, I'll have a couple of cups of coffee and it still doesn't become clear.
I wonder what you think sometimes, too.
Me too. And you know, and you're not the first person to ask me. Usually the phrasing is different. It's usually, what were you thinking? What were you I mean, there's bafflement usually with people who have that question for me.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear from someone who figured that out.
And I have a lot of responses to that. They usually begin with, "Well, officer, it was like this."
And then you call Stephen Lee for your defense.
Yes, and then he laughs and laughs and says, "Let me wipe the tears from my face and tell you, no, I'm sorry, I'm busy that week."
You can only hope.
Yeah.
Well, we have done enough damage around these parts this time. This is the eminently prosecutable Scott Monty.
And this is the completely without an alibi Burt Wolder.
The defenseless Burt Wolder.
Defenseless Burt Wolder.
And together, we say, the games
of foot. I didn't do it.
The games of foot.
I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.